我们站到马边，我这是死在马边，只为哭啊，把父亲的脚啊跟啊把它扭打扭。那么这个病人死了以后啊，确实很痛苦，所以喊的了。
A Chinese prisoner screams as his Japanese captors drag him down a dark hallway. Upon reaching the medical room, he is bound hand and foot so that he cannot escape. With sadistic expressions, Japanese doctors inject him with diseases that will destroy his body in a few days: cholera, syphilis, typhoid fever, and many other plagues. For them, the prisoner is just a test animal that can be mistreated and discarded once the plague consumes him. Then, to avoid problems, his remains will be burned. These are the kinds of hellish stories that the Chinese lived through during the Japanese occupation during World War II. Today, in this episode of Military History, we will review the most gruesome crimes perpetrated by the Japanese island, as well as the ways in which it annihilated hundreds of thousands of Chinese using biological warfare. Since the 19th century, Japan developed an ideological stance that viewed the populations of other Asian countries as inferior races that needed to be controlled by the Japanese Empire. As a result, Japan repeatedly went to war with China, conquering important regions such as Manchuria. It was in this area that one of the most brutal torture institutions in history was established, Unit 731, also known as Squadron 731. This was a covert program for the research and development of biological weapons for the Imperial Japanese Army. There, on Manchurian soil, the Japanese invaders conducted some of the most infamous experiments on record, with the aim of developing weapons of mass destruction that could bring the Allies to their knees. In the process, they engaged in tortures that harmed the bodies of innocent prisoners through unnecessary surgeries, injections filled with diseases, and other barbaric methods that would have shocked even the Nazis themselves.
Deep in Manchuria, Japan had developed a weapon of mass destruction no other nation yet possessed. A weapon she could use to attack the continental United States. This weapon had been created by Unit 731, the brainchild of soldier-scientist General Shiro Ishii.
Later, we will delve into Shiro Ishii, one of Japan's dark figures. But first, let's continue with the historical overview. The origins of the mass murder centers for Chinese civilians can be traced back to the Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937. It was during this period that the medical project codenamed Maruta emerged, which proposed using prisoners as guinea pigs for the most extreme experiments imaginable. The goal was to understand the effects of various diseases on the human body, and this required the suffering of the detainees. There was no compassion, as the doctrine promoted by Emperor Hirohito held that Chinese people were second class and deserved to be treated in this manner. The victims were ironically called marutas, which can be translated as logs in Japanese. This term originated as a joke among the staff, as the authorities of the torture wings of Unit 731 disguised the place as a lumber mill. This reflects that the dehumanization of the victims was present from the very beginning. No one was exempt from undergoing procedures in the Japanese medical facilities in Manchuria. Among the test subjects, in addition to adult men and women, were children, the elderly, and pregnant women. Many experiments and vivisections were carried out on the arms and legs of the victims without the use of anesthetics, as it was believed they might affect the results or were unnecessary since the individuals were restrained.
解剖台があって、解剖台はです。タイルが貼ってありました。そこにです。特別班の班員によって実験中の人、瀕死の状態の人が運び込まれて。
All these horrors were carried out behind a veil of deceit. The facilities were named the Infectious Disease Research and Prevention Laboratory of the Kenpeitai Political Ministry. That last word refers to the militarized police of the Japanese Empire, which was deployed in conquered territories to dominate the locals. The reality of Unit 731 was much darker than a simple preventive center. The only science practiced there was the extermination of Chinese citizens who were considered little more than animals. Now it is time to focus on the master behind all this devastation.
Ishii convinced the Japanese Army High Command to begin a vast research program into a form of warfare even more terrible than the use of gas: germ warfare. Ishii was promoted to major and put in charge of the project. In size and scale, it would come to rival America's atomic bomb project.
As we mentioned earlier, this development would not have been possible without General Shiro Ishii, who is considered by many to be the father of Japan's biological weapons program. He was a radical nationalist who firmly believed that the use of germs and plagues was the future of warfare. In his view, they were formidable tools for his nation's imperial purposes. Since 1932, Ishii was tasked with establishing a center for studying epidemics and developing weapons that could affect enemy health. After several attempts, which exploited the prison populations of various invaded Chinese communities, the military succeeded in organizing the aforementioned Unit 731. For this, he had the support of the Imperial Japanese Youth Corps, Tokyo Research University, the Imperial Militarized Police, and a business front known as the Black Dragons. Each group contributed something different, whether it was money, scientific knowledge, labor, or armed violence.
It was an ideal place to build a biological warfare facility. It was remote. It was controlled by an unholy alliance of the Black Dragons and the military. Secrecy was guaranteed.
An estimated 10,000 people of Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, and Russian descent were subjected to experimentation conducted by Unit 731. However, some American and European prisoners of war also died at the hands of the sinister doctors, who used their knowledge for totally dark purposes. Aside from that, Unit 731's use of biological weapons resulted in tens of thousands of deaths in China, possibly as many as 400,000 victims, according to some estimates. The Japanese tested at least 25 diseases on prisoners and civilians in order to analyze the resistance of the human body, the lethality of each pathogen, and the feasibility of transforming this into large-scale weaponry. What is really dark is that these practices were not limited to the infamous laboratories of Unit 731, but were also applied outside. It is estimated that during the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese poisoned more than 1,000 water wells in rural communities to study the impact they had on the population. This is how hundreds of innocent people died in the most painful ways, infected by cholera and typhus, without medicine at their disposal and suffering extreme poverty as a result of the war. Almost all those who fell ill ended up dead. What results did the Japanese obtain with such a massacre? The answer to their search was not at all original. The most efficient plague was still the classic bubonic plague, which for centuries had been the fear of the entire planet.
The purpose of their experiments was to find out which particular diseases were the most virulent when it came to military use. They tried everything, but in fact it transpired that good old-fashioned medieval bubonic plague was the worst possible disease. Just as well they were doing the experiments in remote Manchuria, because in the end Ishii managed to stockpile enough bubonic plague to wipe out the entire human race.
It's astonishing to think that in the hands of the Japanese Empire, there existed the power to annihilate the entire planet in a horrifying manner. The officials were eager to put these capabilities to use immediately. According to recently declassified documents, in June 1940, the serious consideration of using biological weapons in an attack outside the laboratories was first discussed. The goal of these offensives was to cause epidemics that would decimate the local population, leading to total extermination. Essentially, it was a form of genocide that, instead of using firearms, turned pathogenic agents into the executioners of tens of thousands of civilians. Not only that, but the diseases caused took years to be fully controlled. Although it was impossible to employ these methods against the powerful Allied armies, it was feasible to test this new strategy on the more vulnerable communities of mainland China. To ensure the lethality of these actions, the aforementioned Shiro Ishii, an eminent figure in biological death, was put in charge of the attack. On August 6th, a heavily guarded train departed from the Unit 731 barracks in Pingfang, bound for Hangzhou. Inside were tons of objects and substances infected with fleas carrying bubonic plague. Once the material arrived safely, it was time to proceed with the next step.
Traditional bombing methods would surely kill the fleas in the blast. After years of intensive development, Ishii made a breakthrough. What if the casing of the bomb was made of clay? It would require less charge to explode the bomb, preserving the plague-carrying fleas to spread out with their cargo of death.
By using lighter bombs and materials that were more easily destroyed, it was possible to release the plague without it being eradicated by the explosion or impact upon hitting the ground. Thus, in October 1940, Japan launched one of its most savage attacks on the Chinese population. This was a biological offensive carried out in Zhejiang province, on the eastern coast of the country, an area still not conquered by the Japanese. The operation required a joint effort between Unit 731 of the Imperial Japanese Army and Unit 1644, highlighting the scale of the plans devised by the Japanese front. The actual attack involved dropping tons of seeds, cotton, sand, and solid debris infected with diseases and pests, ready to spread all kinds of plagues from aircraft. The planes departed from Zhangqiao Airport in Hangzhou, traveling hundreds of kilometers with this infamous cargo. The epicenter of these flights was the Ningbo district, particularly the Kaiming Street neighborhoods. This region had a crucial port for receiving supplies for Chinese military forces, making it a high-priority target. Due to the poor living conditions and the enormous number of fleas, epidemics erupted almost immediately. By 1940, the area lacked piped water, so it was common for each family to collect rainwater in large containers, which was used for personal hygiene as well as consumption. The problem was that with every drop came death. The first to die were the roosters and hens, depriving all of Ningbo of a significant portion of their food supply. Next, there was a mass appearance of dead rodents, which was highly suspicious. Neighbors then connected the dots and concluded that the planes that had flown over a few days earlier were not carrying bombs, but diseases. According to the doctoral thesis of Junichi Kaneko, a professional who was part of Unit 731, on October 27, 1940, his team dropped 2 kilograms of bacteria on Ningbo via aircraft. It is estimated that what was dropped on that day claimed the lives of around 1,500 people due to direct and indirect contact with the material that fell from the skies. Once the infection outbreaks began, the Chinese authorities decided to build isolation zones surrounded by 4-meter-high walls. Inside, patients and suspected cases were segregated to prevent the further spread of the plagues. No doctors or food were allowed inside, and people starved to death as the diseases ravaged the population. Within those walls, a hellish existence claimed the lives of thousands. When most of the victims had died, these ghettos were burned to eliminate any trace of the pathogenic agents that had caused the disaster. When the war ended in September 1945, the Japanese government destroyed several of the facilities to erase evidence of these atrocities. It took decades for the world to learn about the events that took place in Manchuria during the Japanese occupation. Let's listen to the testimonies of one of the many men who worked in Unit 731.
それはです。1939年5月にハルピンに行きました。この細かい条文がいろいろ申し渡されたんですが、今でもはっきり覚えているのは、この部隊では見るな、聞くな、言うな、これが鉄則だろうと。
The words of the perpetrators of these crimes speak of orders, directives, and obligations, but we must not forget that, with their hands, they ended the lives of tens of thousands of innocent people. In 2006, Shiro Ishii, a former nurse at Unit 731, recounted that she had helped bury the remains of hundreds of victims of biological warfare. The bodies were destroyed, the various plagues having taken their toll on their appearance. They looked more like bags of meat with a few loose bones inside. Ishii also recounted that she received direct orders from the military leadership and that among her most unpleasant tasks was the separation and classification of limbs and other body parts. Thanks to the work of Professor Katsuo Nishiyama of Shiga University of Medical Science, the Japanese government was forced to declassify many documents concerning the operation of Unit 731. Among the files were revealed the names of more than 3,600 people who worked at the facility, either as doctors or simple lookouts. Nishiyama stated the following during a journalistic interview. The list is important evidence that supports the testimony of those who were involved. The declassification will be a great step towards the disclosure of facts that have been hidden until now. This is no small fact. Japan has made incredible efforts to bury its past in ways both symbolic and literal. During the global conflict, tons of biological and chemical weapons were stored in various places in northeastern China. Their location was a secret, since in many cases they were tubes or containers buried in remote areas. It is evident that the Japanese Empire was preparing for a large-scale use of these elements to resist the increasingly strong advance of the Allies. Regarding the latter, the archipelago's top military commanders were convinced that biological attacks were the future of war. However, World War II had a negative turn for them. The Axis forces were defeated, and that included Japan and its fearsome empire. To safeguard their honor and avoid trials like Nuremberg, they initially sought to deny any connection to the stories we tell throughout this video. But it is difficult to hide the sun with one hand. The Japanese attempt to destroy evidence of the establishment failed because the remains are too harmful to hide, without causing problems in the soil, vegetation, and even people. For example, in August 2003, 29 men were hospitalized after a group of builders in the Chinese region of Heilongjiang unearthed chemical projectiles that had been hidden deep in the ground more than 50 years ago. The scars of the Japanese Empire's horrific methods are still visible, writing bloody pages many decades after the end of the war.
这屋死了5个，太太、祖母、媳妇、儿子，甚至都死了的。有个在肚子里神死那个肚子里面带来胎的一个是，这是一个。
The disease was cholera. The villagers thought it was a curse from God.
Due to their brutality, Unit 731's activities have now been denounced by the United Nations as war crimes, yet few individuals have ever paid for their actions. The bulk of the military leaders, politicians, and doctors who made this hell possible managed to escape with impunity from China to continue their lives as normal in their home country. Many of the scientists involved in Unit 731 went on to prominent careers in politics, education, business, and medicine. Some were arrested by Soviet forces and prosecuted in the Khabarovsk war crimes trials. Others surrendered to the Americans and received amnesty in exchange for access to the information they had collected. As a rule, the Japanese government has avoided remembering these events. Silence is the best form of forgetting when you want to put aside an uncomfortable part of the past. This way we come to the end of the video. If you like this content that refers to the darkest cases of the 20th century, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications for our channel. That way you can stay up to date with all the latest news. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.